Black Jews in Africa and the Americas by Tudor Parfitt. Chapter 1. The Color of Jews. Paragraph 6. A long European tradition maintained that the Jews, in general, were certainly black, metaphorically, in the sense that they were diabolical and evil, as well as black literally. One Christian critic of the supposedly Jewish Pope Anacletus II, elected in 1130, hinted that Jews were generally regarded as dark when he noted that the Pope was dark and pale, more like a Jew or an Arab than a Christian. Sir William Brereton, the English parliamentarian, soldier, and writer, happened to visit a Sephardi synagogue in Amsterdam, where he commented that the Jews were very dark-skinned and lascivious. They were most black and insatiably given unto women. In his New Voyage to Italy, Francois Maximilien Misson, the French writer and traveler, confirms that the general supposition was that Jews were black when he noted that all Jews were black, although only Portuguese Jews started off black. He wrote that the Jews are all black, for this is only true of the Portuguese, who, marrying always among one another, beget children like themselves, and consequently the swarthiness of their complexion is entailed upon their whole race, even in the northern regions. Jews had absorbed something of these attitudes and perceived themselves as being significantly darker than their neighbors, and accepted the argument that, as part of the divine plan and as a kind of retribution for their sins, they had been gradually darkened by the intervention of the Almighty until they were almost black. This was the position of Isaac ben Judah of Bourbeno, the Portuguese Jewish statesman, exegete, and financier, who observed that once long ago the Jews had been light-skinned, as the Mishnah maintains, but they had grown dark as part of the punishment of exile. The 13th century polemic text of R. Yosef ben Nathan Officio sought to rebut Christian charges that Jews were dark and unattractive. Why, the text reads, are the majority of Gentiles white and attractive, while the majority of Jews are black and ugly? The writer explained this through an analogy of ripening fruit. Plums and sloes, he argued, are white at the start and become dark when they are ripe, whereas fruits like apples or apricots, which are red to start with, finish up white and shriveled. This is seen as meaning the Jews who have no contact with the red of menstrual blood at the moment of their conception, as Jews refrain from sexual intercourse during their menstrual period, will finish up black, whereas Christians who do not avoid the red of menstrual blood during sexual intercourse will finish up white like apples. The same thought is expressed in the contemporary Sefer Yosef HaMakana, which boasts that we Jews are from a clean and white seed, therefore our faces are black, but you from the red seed of menstruation, therefore your visages are pale and reddened. The idea that the Jews were black persisted into the 19th century. Robert Knox, the controversial surgeon and anatomist and conservator of the College Museum, Edinburgh, in the mid-19th century commented on the African character of the Jew, his muzzle-shaped mouth and face removing him from other races. The general look of the Jew was considered to be like that of the black. The contour is convex, the eyes long and fine, the outer angles running towards the temples, the brow and nose appoint to form a single convex line, and the whole physiognomy, when swarthy, as it often is, has an African look. 19th century physical anthropologists in general assumed that Jews had a close racial, that is blood, connection with blacks. The general consensus of the ethnological literature of the late 19th century was that the Jews were black, or at least swarthy. One such explained the predominant mouth of some Jews being the result of the presence of black blood, and that brown skin, thick lips, and prognathism were typical of Jews. One of the physical indicators of race was the nose. For encyclopedists, all deviant noses were put together: the blacks, the Hottentots, and various peoples of Asia, such as the Jews. In a sense, the appearance of Jews and blacks was constructed in a similar way simply because both Jews and blacks were pariahs and outsiders. And in the racialized mind of Europe, this shared status implied that Jews and blacks had a shared look and a shared black color. In some cases, Jews were considered black because they were of mixed African Judaic race. On occasion, the blackness or darkness of the skin of the African, like the Jew, was perceived as being not only due to inheritance, but also to the effect of diseases such as syphilis. The negritude or darkness of the Jew was thus not only a mark of racial inferiority or of shared blood with Africans, but also a clear indicator of the unhealthy nature of the Jew. The Bavarian writer Johann Pezel, who visited Vienna in the 1780s, described the Jewishness of the Viennese Jew as a particularly nasty physical affliction. He wrote, "There are about 500 Jews in Vienna. Their sole and only occupation is to counterfeit, salvage trade in coins, and cheat Christians, Turks, heathens, indeed themselves. This is the beggarly filth of Canaan, which can only be exceeded in filth, uncleanliness, stench, disgust, poverty, dishonesty, pushiness, and other things by the trash of the 12 tribes from Galatia. Excluding the Indian fakirs, there is no category of supposed human beings which come closer to the orangutan than does a Polish Jew. Covered from foot to head in filth, dirt, and rags, covered in a type of black sack, their necks expose the color of a black, their faces covered up to the eyes with a beard, which would have given the high priest in the temple chills. The hair turned and knotted as if they all suffered from the plica polonica. The Viennese Jew's disease was stamped on his skin. The Jewish physician of the Enlightenment, Elkan Isaac Wolf, also saw this black-yellow skin color as a pathological mark of the sickly Jew. In 1808, the English physician and ethnographer James Cowles Pritchard made a connection between the national character and psychology of Jews and their color. He wrote about the choleric and melancholic constitution of the Jews, such that they usually have a skin color somewhat darker than the English people. Some of the theories advanced to explain the color of Jews going back to the time of Bruno were simply to those advanced in the United States to explain the color of blacks. One explanation was that blackness or darkness of the skin, as in the case of Jews, was a sickness. Benjamin Rush, one of the founding fathers of the United States, claimed in a paper before the American Philosophical Society that Africans' black skin had been caused by a disease, something like leprosy, that had become hereditary, but which could be cured, and he suggested some ways in which they could be done. All races, according to the ethnology of the period, were described as ugly or beautiful. In Europe, for hundreds of years, being black, Jewish, sickly, and ugly became almost coterminous. Black Africans, and particularly the Hottentots, as the famous and appalling case of Sarah Bartman, the so-called Hottentot Venice shows, became the paradigm of the extreme other and the ugly race, a sort of missing link between true humanity and the orangutan. It is certainly not without significance from the 18th century on, Hottentots were also regarded by some as having Jewish roots, to be biological descendants of Jews. Such notions about Jews were supported by the racial ideas of Houston Stewart Chamberlain, according to whom the Jews were a Mongol race that had hybridized with surrounding peoples in very ancient times, but who had later interbred with black Africans in Egypt. The first point is thus settled, wrote Chamberlain. The Israelite people is descended from the crossing of different human types. Now these figures give the following results with regard to the Jews of former times, and today, in East and West, 50%, show clear evidence of belongings of the type of Homo syriacus, short heads, characteristics so-called Jewish noses, inclination to stoutness. Only 5% have the features and anatomical structure of the genuine Semite. In the case of 10%, we could find a color of skin and hair, often two of complexion, which point to the Amorite of Indo-European descent, 35%, represents indefinable mixed forms. The chief result of this anatomical survey is that the Jewish race is in truth a permanent, but at the same time a mongrel race, which always retains this mongrel character. Its African aspect was developed somewhat later with the admixture of Negro blood with Jewish in the diaspora of Alexandria, of which many a man of Jewish persuasion as this day offers living proof. In an increasingly color-conscious Europe, Jews were anxious to be seen as white. It had been argued that in order to avoid the racial color stigma arising from the coupling of Jews and blacks, and in the accusations that they were black and ugly, Jews employed the stratagem of loudly proclaiming their own whiteness in order to include themselves in the dominant culture. In a way, they could not as non-Christians. From the beginning of the modern period, racial distinctions based on color became increasingly important in Europe and the Americas. Such considerations led the Jews of Amsterdam, for instance, increasingly and deliberately to distance themselves from their black servants. Similarly, black Jews, possibly converted slaves, were no longer permitted to read from the Torah in synagogue or to be buried in Jewish cemeteries. In Amsterdam, many Jews maintained African slaves, and in some cases followed the prescriptions of halakha, the call on Jewish owners of slaves to urge them to convert to Judaism. Such conversions accounted for a significant population of black Jews in colonial contexts, as well as in Amsterdam until the beginning of the 18th century. Thereafter, black Jews were increasingly marginalized, deprived of privileges such as the right to be buried in the communal cemetery, and the conversion of black slaves was no longer encouraged, despite halakha. According to a report of 1788, there were 1,311 white Jews and 650 mulatto and black Jews in the Suriname. Previously, there had been a good deal of mingling of black and white within the Jewish community, so much so that there were Jews of mixed blood involved in the governance of synagogues. However, with the new sensitivity about skin color, special ordinances were passed in which it was decided not to admit mulattoes as full members. Moreover, in a view of the fact that some mulattoes had been involved in the governance of the community, it was decreed that henceforth they would not be allowed to this honor. They would be demoted to simple congregant. Thus, Jews of mixed race, whether halakhically Jewish or not, were severely restricted in their membership to synagogues. In the New York Jewish Record of January 23, 1863, an article concerned with the issue of the abolition of slavery suggested that Jews were anxious to avoid any such linkage between themselves and blacks. We know not how to speak in the same breath of the Negro and the Israelite. The very names have startling opposite sounds, one representing all that is debased and inferior in the hopeless barbarity and heathenism of 6,000 years. The other, the days when Jehovah conferred on our fathers the glorious equality which led the Eternal to converse with them, and allow them to enjoy the communion of angels. Thus, the abandoned fanatics insult the choice of God himself. In endeavoring to reverse the inferiority which he stamped on the African, to make him the compeer, even in bondage, of his chosen people, there is no parallel between such races. Humanity from pole to pole would scout such a comparison. The Hebrew was originally free, and the character of his liberty was inspired by his creator. The Negro was never free, and his bondage in Africa was simply duplicated in a milder form when he was imported here. The judicious in all the earth agree that to proclaim the African equal to the surrounding races would be a farce, which would lead to civilized convertism of the world to denounce the outrage. This vehement protest against linkage between blacks and Jews availed little. The discourse suggesting that Jews were black continued, and if anything, gained momentum. In the United States, also in South Africa, in the first decades of the 20th century, immigrant Jews were confronted with the question whether the Jews, long depicted as dark or black, were racially to do with Africa or Europe, and this inevitably caused consternation. Both in the United States and South Africa, Jews were certainly not perceived as white until around the time of the Second World War. That such discourses are still alive can be seen from the views of Kenna from Brooklyn, New York, who in March 2010 opened on the internet, "Jews evolved from blacks. That's why they have big noses and tightly coiled hair." It's not just a stereotype. Stereotypes come from a thread of truth, not just out of thin air. Like most blacks have kinky hair and puffy lips, Jews are just ashamed at that fact that they are part black. Nobody likes black. God, should a Jew be black, right? People are so racist. Accept it. Black stereotypes are suspiciously similar to Jewish stereotypes, i.e. greedy, backstabbing, big noses, kinky hair, flat feet, long limbs, olive-colored skin, etc. Should I go on? In these fragmentary glimpses drawn from a variety of sources, we can see that Jews were considered to be black, to have a number of African physical qualities, and ultimately to have a good deal of African blood. Similarly, black Africans in the 19th century and before, in a vast and extraordinary number of cases, were thought to be Jews. And indeed, to have both Jewish characteristics and to be descended from ancient Israelite stock. From medieval times to the present, Jews have been thought to have black blood in their veins, and to have a number of African physical and other characteristics, including an African nose, African proportions, and African skin color. Similarly, over the same time span, in a long-running discourse, many black Africans were assumed to have Jewish blood. Jewish characteristics, Jewish looks, Jewish abilities, and Jewish habits. The supposedly Jewish origins of some black African communities were taken to explain a wide variety of hard-to-understand African customs and beliefs, which were assumed to be predicated upon Jewish customs and beliefs. Often, colonial officials and missionaries imagined that various African languages were connected with Hebrew, Aramaic, and other Semitic tongues, and frequently they would maintain that they derived directly from Hebrew. Such identifications were made out of a genuine desire to comprehend the seemingly impenetrable customs, religions, and languages encountered on the colonial frontier. Ethnographers, missionaries, colonial civil servants, and travelers time and time again maintain that African tribes, including the Xhosa, Maasai, Yoruba, Shona, Igbo, Zulus, Hottentots, Tutsis, Ashanti, and many more, practiced Jewish customs, spoke particularly or partially Jewish languages, and were of Jewish biological origin, of the seed of Abraham. This was one of the developments that has fed into the creation of the worldwide phenomenon of Black Judaism. Today, there are millions of Black Jews, Israelites, or Hebrews, most of them at least partially Christian, in Africa, Europe, and the Americas, who practice some aspects of Judaism or have some kind of Israelite, Jewish, Hebrew identity, and who in most cases believe they are descended from the ancient Hebrews. Whereas there were many reasons for this, the deeply held conviction that Jews were black or darker, or that Jews and blacks had the same blood, no doubt played a predominant role.